Support comes from BECU, a member-owned credit union putting people over profit, offering financial services and support to the community with access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs, and online resources at becu.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Monday. This is Seattle Now. We've got super low tides coming to a Puget Sound beach near you all this week. A great chance to hit the tide pools and see an amazing hidden ecosystem up close. We'll talk with natural historian David Williams about our long-running connection to the Sound in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. It's go home time in Olympia. State lawmakers finished up their first ever remote session last night. Among the big new ideas coming to Washington, a new clean fuel standard and a capital gains tax that will probably end up in court. The legislature also recriminalized drug possession after the state Supreme Court struck down our old law. For now, possession will be a misdemeanor. We'll talk more about the legislature's changes around justice and policing on tomorrow's show. The J&J vaccine is back in service. Governor Inslee okayed it over the weekend after the CDC recommended using it again. Meanwhile, King County may be about to take a step backwards. We're over the line on new cases and getting very close on hospitalizations. If we're failing both on May 3rd, it's back to phase 2 for Seattle. And Seattle's new NHL team just got body checked by a U District dive bar. Earlier this month, the Kraken announced plans to open the Kraken Bar and Grill at the team's Northgate practice facility. But the Seattle Times reports that was too much for the owners of the Kraken Bar and Lounge, doing business in the U District since 2011. According to a trademark lawsuit filed last week, the owners say they've already had hockey fans showing up at their punk and metal bar, thinking it was related to the team somehow. The Times says late Friday night, the Hockey Kraken said they'd come up with a different name for the restaurant. We could do better when it comes to taking care of Puget Sound. Maybe it would be easier if we dug deeper into the connections between us and a 150-year-old Gooey Duck. David Williams is a natural historian and writer. He's got a new book about Puget Sound called Homewaters, A Human and Natural History of Puget Sound. I met him on a blustery morning at Richmond Beach, up in Shoreline, to talk about the ties humans living here have had with the Sound for thousands of years. David, thanks for meeting me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Fun to be on the shores of the Sound in this beautiful place.
Now, salmon and orca, they are the superstars of Puget Sound. They get a ton of attention. But you make the case for some underrated vegetation under the sea here, first of which was kelp. Why should we be concerned with kelp, and why is kelp underrated?
Kelp is underrated for the simple reason that we all think of it as seaweed, and we only really see it on the shore. And I was that way. I just thought, it's that spinachy, lettucey, sort of stinky stuff on the shore. But under the water here is a forest. It's an ecosystem that's equally as important, equally as complex as the temperate rainforest that we all know and love here. So kelp that grows up, the bull kelp, that's an annual species, so it grows every year, basically replaces itself. And it's a nursery in the sense that growing up, it provides habitat for young animals down there. I mean, hundreds of different species take advantage of that. It also sloughs off an incredible amount of carbon and food resources. So it's a real critical part of the story. And then there's this deep time connection. What I love about it is there's this idea that's been developed over the last 20 years or so of what's called the Kelp Highway. And this is the idea that people came into the New World, not traveling overland, but traveling along the water, traveling along the kelp shore that grows right across kelp-like shallow water. So people could travel along, find basically a safe harbor coming down the shore. And one of the off-ramps would have been Puget Sound 15,000 years ago. So perhaps our deepest connection with place is through the kelp that grows here.
We're here at Richmond Beach in Shoreline, and we're looking west towards the Olympic Peninsula. And today it's pretty cloudy. We got a little bit of a drizzle coming down, which is a spring in Seattle, if I've ever seen one. But in my mind's eye, there's a gorgeous mountain range there. And I wonder, where am I standing? How did I get to this view?
I mean, what's interesting about the Sound is that it's a relatively young landscape, in the sense that we're really shaped by a landscape that began about 18,000 years ago during the last ice age, when this massive sheet of ice moved from Canada down here, plowed through the region. In Seattle, if we had been here then, we would be under 3,000 feet of ice, so 6 Space Needles, which is pretty amazing to think about, or 5 Space Needles. And so it sculpted the land, created this deep body of water, which was actually carved not by the ice itself, but by water flowing underneath the ice and excavating down into the sediments. So that's really, it's the geologic story, a very young geologic story compared to places like the East Coast, hundreds of millions of years. Here we have a young landscape, which means it's dynamic, which means it's ever-changing. Our volcanoes, our landslides, all of that contributes to the story of the Sound.
It's amazing to look out there and see the water and know that underneath there is an entire world that we don't see. It's truly amazing to just contemplate that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to think that if we look out over the Sound, there are Gooey Duck out there that were born 150, 160 years ago. The oldest known Gooey Duck, 173 years old. There are rockfish out there that could potentially live for 200 years. So just that simple fact of the great age that is in these animals and what they have experienced. They have experienced all the changes in the Sound, and that they have somehow survived. To me, that also is hopeful, that what we do right now, maybe it's not going to have an effect in 5 years. Maybe it's not going to have an effect in 10. But 30, 40, 50 years down the road, it will have an effect. And these animals that can live here that long, they will benefit from our action. And that, again, it's inspiration right there.
You said Gooey Duck, that strange-looking mollusk and sometimes delicacy and underrated species here in Puget Sound.
Yeah, exactly. Gooey Duck are astounding. I was lucky enough to go out with some Gooey Duck divers, because it used to be thought that up until the 1960s that Gooey Duck were just this intertidal organism that was just, tide goes way out, we can get them. We now know that they're deep in the water. They go down 200, 300 feet deep. There are hundreds of millions of them out there. Just like the Sound is Gooey Duck heaven. Bazillions of them out there. And people have been collecting them, and now much of it gets harvested. There's a lot of harvest. But I was out with Suquamish divers going down, who dive into 60 feet deep of water and pull up Gooey Duck. And it's sort of amazing to think this Gooey Duck that had been minding its own business down in the Sound, the next day after being harvested was going to be in China. And it's this weird combination of this animal that's so intrinsic to the Sound, and yet it's also so intrinsic to the economic story that we have this global world that you can see it's just right out off the bay here, off the water.
For the uninitiated, if you're Googling Gooey Duck, it's Geoduck.
And it's a native term from the Lushootseed, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, something on the order of Gooey Duck, which meant dig deep, which obviously is the relationship, that you have to dig down to get this animal.
Amazing. What else surprised you about this area when you started to dig deeper?
Well, I think the diversity in the Sound, again, the rockfish species that I talked about, there's 28 or 27 different species in the single genus, which is pretty amazing. And then there's the human history. And another reason I stopped here, I like this spot, is we have these pilings just off from us that go out into the water. And one of the things that I wrote about and I really wanted to think about in the Sound is not just the natural history. I really wanted to look at the human history. And one story I look at is the Sound is a maritime highway, and investigating the mosquito fleet, this armada of vessels that plowed the Sound in the late 1800s, early 1900s, stopped everywhere, carried people, goods everywhere. And I really tend to think that when we see these pilings on the shore here that seem to go out, like, what are they doing here? My guess is a lot of this had to do with mosquito fleet stops. That these boats could stop anywhere. There would just be these piers going out, docks going out. So again, it's this idea that people have been living here for so many years. And this, again, how did people move through the Sound? And that for decades, for thousands of years, but really also after Europeans arrived, the main way people got around was on the water. That you had to basically, that was almost your life all the time, was on the water. And we've lost that. And that's, again, part of what I'm trying to explore in the book is how do we connect back to the water? Sitting and watching the tide go out, being out in a canoe, being on a ferry. One of the things that I did in the book was try and ride all the ferries in Puget Sound. And I got to spend time with ferry boat captain, Marcia Morris. And she made this, I thought was just a very profound insight, is that when you're out on the Sound, you have these big vistas that we can't always get when we're hiking in the woods. And with that big vista, there's a spiritual aspect of being on the ferry boat. And I just thought that was a really beautiful way to think about it. It's very utilitarian, but it's also spiritual.
David Williams, appreciate your book and appreciate your time today. And maybe if people are deciding to appreciate the land, take a trash bag with you and take some stuff on your way out if you find it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. How can I complain? To be on the beach it's a beautiful day.
Beautiful day, the shoreline.
Seattle Now is produced by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, Clare McGrane, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.